Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services here at the Center for Jewish History, which is the collaborative home for 5 partner organizations that together form the largest archive on the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. We are also the home of the Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute, which is the proud sponsor of the program, the pilot program that we are kicking off today, the DNA Reunion Project at the Center for Jewish History. So this project aims to raise awareness about the benefits of DNA testing for Holocaust survivors, with the hope of unlocking mysteries and even reuniting living descendants of families separated by the Holocaust. To that end, we are sending free kits to Holocaust survivors who apply through our website, and children of survivors can also apply. Those will be decided on a case-by-case basis based on funding. I do want to point out that these kits will be sent from commercial DNA testing companies like Ancestry.com. So if you have already done one of these tests or plan to do so, feel free to go ahead. If you have questions about interpreting your results, you can email dna@cjh.org. I'll put that in the chat, and we will add you to our mailing list for an upcoming workshop on that topic, an online workshop with our genetic genealogist. As I mentioned, this is a pilot project. We are launching it on Giving Tuesday because we would like it to become an ongoing self-sustaining initiative. In order for that to happen, we are trying to get the word out and ask for your support. It seems like the demand will be high, so please be patient with us. We will help as many people as we can. And I will put in the chat the fundraising page for the project, which you should, of course, feel free to share with others. The educational and consultation arm of this project will be overseen by 2 genealogists on the call with us today, and they have particular expertise in Jewish genetic genealogy, as well as expertise in helping Holocaust survivors recover their lost histories, and they will be explaining all that to you today. Before I introduce everyone on the call, just a couple of housekeeping items. You'll see the chat is disabled for participants, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. No need to raise your hand or use that icon. We will get to questions at the end, but feel free to type them in as we go along. Today's program is being recorded and should be available on the center's webpage and YouTube page within about a week or so. And if you registered for this event, you will receive an email with a link to the recording. I also want to mention that we do have listening in today a couple of reporters who would be interested in speaking to any of you who are on this call. If you are willing to tell your story and explain why you are interested in this initiative, what knowledge you hope to gain through DNA testing. And this, of course, is if you might want to be featured in a news story. So if that's the case, you can send an email to our communications person, Ilana Rosenbluth, and she will get you in touch with the reporter, and I will put her email address in the chat as well. All right, so let's get started. I would like to introduce you to our speakers. Jennifer Mendelsohn is a sought-after genealogist who specializes in helping Eastern European Jewish families shattered by the Holocaust reclaim their history. She is also known for the innovative use of genealogy as a tool for activism. She created the viral hashtag #ResistanceGenealogy, which uses genealogical and historical records to fight disinformation and honor America's immigrant past. The project received international media attention, including being featured on CNN.com, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and Yahoo News. A native Long Islander now based in Baltimore, Jennifer serves on the board of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Maryland and is the administrator of Facebook's Jewish Genetic Genealogy group with over 10,000 members worldwide. Prior to her work as a genealogist, Jennifer spent many years as a freelance journalist, and her work has appeared in countless publications. Adina Newman is the creator of My Family Genie, where she assists clients with research and blogs about her genealogy musings. Her specialties are in Jewish genealogy, genetic genealogy, social media, and New England, and she presents on these topics in a variety of venues, from major genealogy conferences to local genealogy societies. Her findings have received international media attention, including mentions in the Daily Mail and the Times of Israel, and appearances on Boston 25 News. She volunteers as a moderator for a Jewish genetic genealogy Facebook group and on the program committee for her local Jewish Genealogical Society. She was also a 2020 recipient of the Ancestry Pro Genealogist Scholarships. They will be speaking with Jackie Young, a child survivor who now lives in London, who was featured on the BBC show DNA Family Secrets. Jennifer and Adina were able to track down his biological father, as well as locate living relatives. So he'll be able to share his story with you. And moderating the conversation will be Daniel Mendelsohn, a memoirist, critic, essayist, and translator. He is the editor-at-large of the New York Review of Books and a professor of humanities at Bard College. His books include An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, a translation of the Greek poet Constantine Cavafy, and 3 collections of essays. His 10th book, 3 Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate, was published in 2020. And before you ask, yes, he is Jennifer's brother. They're a very accomplished family. So thank you all for being here. I will turn off my camera for a bit and come back at the end for Q&A.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for being here. I'm just going to jump right in. I know that there's a lot that we have to cover today. And I thought, and of course, the highlight in many ways is going to be our conversation with Jackie Young, whose story exemplifies what can be done with research such as that's going to be accomplished by the DNA Reunion Project in conjunction with the Center for Jewish History. But before we get to Jackie, I just thought it'd be helpful to the audience to sort of lay out some of the ABCs of what Jennifer and Adina you are doing and what this kind of genealogical research specifically means. And I'd actually like to start the ball rolling by asking each of you in turn, what was the road that took you here? How did you get into the sort of genealogy business, but more specifically, what led you to DNA and what that has meant for you? So Adina, maybe you want to start and just give the audience a sense of how you came to be here.
Sure. So like many others, I started on the traditional genealogy path. I'm sort of the baby of my family, and I grew up with that, you know, back before you were born, your grandfather here and there, you know, all those stories. So I grew up with that really important sense of family. And when I started my own family, I became really interested in genealogy, and I heard about DNA testing. So I said, okay, I'll take a DNA test. And, you know, me back then, I was more interested in the 1%, I think, Scandinavian that popped up. And I tried to make sense of what that was in conjunction with my 99% Ashkenazi Jewish. But with my results, there were things that didn't quite make sense. To be more specific, there were matches that were fairly close that I just did not recognize. And somebody who grew up knowing the family tree and kind of having it in your brain all the time, I had to figure it out. So I had one parent test, the parent I thought I'd be connected to, and that was not the case. And then I had the other parent test, and oh, this is a fairly close match. So I became hooked. And like many others, my kind of avenue into genetic genealogy was through social media. There's a very popular group called DNA Detectives, where, you know, many of us in the field are familiar with. And I just devoured everything I could learn in order to make sense of my own mysteries. And at that point, I tested on another DNA testing site. I started at 23andMe and I went to Ancestry, and there were more matches that didn't make sense. And to keep the story fairly concise, we found that I had an uncle that we never knew about. And that match on 23andMe was actually another branch that we didn't know about. So I had lots of fun secrets in my family, and it felt good to figure that out. And this family has been such a blessing. And I love to now help people solve their own mysteries. And through all of this work, I met Jennifer, and we became she invited me one day, said, hey, do you want to, help be an administrator in this Facebook group? And I said, sure. And, kind of the rest is history. And, Jennifer will speak to her story, which is different. But when you're in that environment and you're seeing all these people who have lost their families and, don't have these reunion stories like I'm able to have, it just, a light bulb went off. And I thought, this is the technology. This is what's going to really fill that void.
I have a question before I turn to Jen, which is, I mean, at any point, as someone who in my sort of early years as a family historian only did archival traditional kinds of genealogy, was there any point at which that's what you were doing, or was it sort of DNA related from the get-go?
I definitely, it was sort of in conjunction. It's really important for people to understand that DNA is a wonderful, wonderful tool, but DNA is not a silver bullet. We use traditional records to make sense of the DNA. So you have to have an understanding of that paper trail, traditional genealogy, and the DNA. And that's a real specialty. And, for the community we're hoping to help here, you need to have a grasp of both. So I quickly felt that, this is the place I should be at this time.
Great, thank you. Now I'm going to have to pretend that I don't know Jennifer's story so that she can tell it.
Well, we should say that we almost were going to do this Zoom from our childhood home on Long Island, which would have been hilarious, but we are in our individual homes instead. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Lauren, for having us. Hello to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. So when I think about this, sort of what led me to today, it's funny because it seems like it was almost like a gradual progression where every step I took genealogically sort of helped me focus and fit and put me directly in the path of this project. It was like I sort of started with the big picture, and little by little I learned that what I wanted to be doing was specifically this. In my case, it's we joke about being brother and sister, but having the exposure to your book, The Lost, which is now we did the initial trip for that book over 20 years ago. It's funny, I was not at all a lifelong genealogist like you were. You were always so interested in the family history. I went along for the ride, but I think it was sort of important grounding, though I didn't know it at the time, because what I learned from your book, the subtitle of which is A Search for 6 of 6 Million, was that it was not necessary to sort of just gesture broadly to people who were lost in the Holocaust, that it was possible to identify them, to know exactly what became of them, because that's a huge and pervasive and damaging myth in our community. People don't begin the search because they don't think there's anything to find. So, years later, when I became a genealogist, that was in the back of my head. And in an incredible stroke of good luck, the path that started me and propelled me to this day was that the very first genealogical search I ever undertook, sort of completely accidentally resulted in like a grand slam home run, which is that my husband had a 95-year-old Holocaust survivor grandmother who I adored. She had lost her entire nuclear family. She had lost most of her extended family, and sort of an accidental discovery in 2013, I discovered that she had 3 living first cousins and reunited them. And it profoundly changed our entire family. It was such a moving thing to be a part of. She later said to me, I now know why I lived so long. I lived so long so I could see this day. And, that's big stuff. And that got me hooked. I just sort of continued. My interest in that was done completely on paper, although we later confirmed via DNA that we had found the right people. I then, like Adina, became interested in DNA testing and the possibilities of DNA testing. And I saw how absolutely miraculous it could be in answering questions that can't be answered on paper. I continued to do a lot of, DNA reunions. I continued to do a lot of Holocaust reunions. And slowly I thought, what better use of this DNA technology than to the community of survivors? And I began to focus specifically on using DNA to answer questions and facilitate reunions for Holocaust survivors.
I personally find this interesting because when so as Jennifer mentioned, I was sort of the family historian from a young age, and I would sort of sit down with old relatives at, holidays and get their stories and make rudimentary family trees. And now I think between the internet and DNA, the whole game has changed radically. When I was doing the preparatory research for the lost before we actually went to Eastern Europe, it was still a matter of writing to, mean librarians in Ukrainian archives. And after a year, you would get a package of badly mimeographed records back. So clearly, this is just 25 years. So the whole business has radically transformed. And before we get specifically to the DNA Reunion Project and Jackie's story, I want to first ask Adina, if you could just quickly explain to the audience exactly what DNA genealogy is, how it works, what it can achieve. And then Jennifer, I'm going to turn to you and ask about the caveats, drawbacks, and pitfalls. Okay. Adina?
Yeah, sure. So when we're talking about DNA, a lot of people think immediately to blood, and that's not the case. It is a saliva-based test. Typically, it is a spit test. You spit into a tube. In some cases, it's a swab test. So it's all saliva-based. Our test of choice mostly is ancestry DNA. There are other instances where we would be sending another kit. And that's because when you test there, you have access to the largest database, millions of people. I think they're up to 21 million people right now. So when you test there, you have the best chance of finding relatives. What happens after you test, you get two things that come from your test. Your results arrive. You get an ethnicity estimate, which a lot of people, including myself when I started, was very exciting or very disappointing because people get 100% Ashkenazi Jewish, or I think they're Jewish peoples of Europe now at Ancestry. And they said, but I want to know what country. And you're not going to get that. A lot of times people don't realize you get a list of matches. And that is the fun part. That is what genetic genealogy is. And what that tells you is it gives you an amount of what we call centimorgans. That's our unit of distance. And it gives a number like 1,000 centimorgans. And we have a sense of what 1,000 centimorgans means in terms of a relationship. And you just have this broad range. And with that, in conjunction, as I said, you need the paper trail. We don't just get that number and say, that's the relationship. We can't do that. We have to look at people's trees. And I love the terminology Jennifer tends to use. We have to reverse engineer the tree and take somebody else's matches and build backwards until we can figure out how someone is related.
So let me ask you, because I'm back in the Stone Age of, looking through records. So what does this mean, centimorgan? Like what does that mean? And
yeah, it's just
how
a
does
unit.
it help you establish relationships?
Yeah, so it's a unit of distance, basically, that we use. So you have a broad range, basically from nothing to around 3,600. That's kind of your range. 3,600 indicates you're a parent, a child, that relationship, and then it kind of dwindles down from there. So we use the amount as a starting point of where to look, but it is not the answer.
I see. So if you get like 1,000, it means you're at first cousin once removed, or some possible
first cousin, right? We have an idea. But you can't just say that's the relationship. That's where we have to start looking at people's trees. We have to look at all the records that any genealogist look.
Right.
Way to explain it.
Okay. And Jennifer, I know because I've spoken to you about this personally, but I think people should know. So Adina has sort of explained what it is, what you're looking for, what it can tell you to a certain extent. And Jennifer, I know that you are always interested in pointing out, I wouldn't say the limitations, but what are the caveats? What do people have to be aware of? Adina already mentioned, this is not going to tell you everything. It's
Right.
it's a useful tool in conjunction with other methods. So can you expand on that a little?
Sure. Before I do, I want to add to what Adina said, just so we're very clear about how this technology can help people, and specifically help people in our community. Two things can happen when survivors or their children can take a commercial DNA test. One is that they can connect with relatives who they might not have known were alive. People may show up on your match list who descend from people who survived, who you did not realize. And the only way to find them would be through DNA, because you don't know how to search for them on paper. I've many times told the story of my friend and colleague, Lara Diamond, who her grandfather had told her when she dutifully wrote down the family tree that a certain aunt had perished in the Holocaust. Lara had no reason not to think differently. And she got a DNA match to someone. And when they started corresponding, it turned out that she had not perished in the Holocaust. She was living in Detroit. So it's things like that that can happen. And secondly, it can, short of an actual reunion, sometimes your matches to distant people can help you learn things about your tree, because you may have a roadblock in your own tree that can't be followed up on paper, but you match to someone who doesn't have that same roadblock, and you know that you are related because of the amount of DNA you share, and perhaps their grandparent has naturalization papers you can find when you can't find your own great, so it's a way of filling in gaps, and that can be so valuable in our community. In terms of roadblocks, people sometimes think, DNA is a magic bullet that is going to, automatically reconfigure your tree and, tell you what town your family came from. It can't do that. You still have to do the difficult paper trail, slogging through records and identifying a town of origin, et cetera, et cetera. But it really can be like a fast pass. I joke, it's like, the Disney pass that gets you to the head of the line, because you can use DNA to make connections, to immediate connections to people that cannot be made on paper. And, in an important foreshadowing of, we're about to talk to Jackie, for survivors like Jackie, for whom there is no paper trail, DNA can be the only way to reconstruct their family tree. Was there anything else, Dina, in terms of misconceptions?
I just want to briefly touch on the concept of endogamy, because that's a big feature
I
of
was
the
going to
DNA.
ask about,
For a roadblock. So, Ashkenazi Jews are considered an endogamous population. There's several other endogamous populations. Endogamy really means that you descend from a limited pool of people, and over generations, that pool is the only people that you can draw your DNA from, because they're marrying cousins or, for years. So what that does to your DNA is you share lots of teeny tiny segments with everyone. So they say sometimes the Ashkenazi Jews are all fourth cousins to each other based on the DNA. But what that does for genetic genealogy is that it makes people who might not otherwise be related look related, or it might make around, third cousins look slightly closer. So it kind of throws a wrench in what we typically do in genetic genealogy, and adds, I call it, I play video games, so it's kind of the epic level of it as opposed to the novice level.
right. But so in other words, because there is so much intermarriage among a relatively small gene pool, it can give you results that are possibly confusing,
Yes.
rather than illuminate. Not always, but possibly.
Not always, but part of this process and learning how to do this is teasing through what is a legitimate match worth pursuing, and those that cannot be found. And you will notice, if you are Ashkenazi Jewish, you may have close to 200,000 matches. You're all sharing, you're all cousins in some way, but most of those will not be traceable. You need a methodology in order to figure out which ones are possible.
Right.
And I should add that becomes important, because there's a huge community of people out there doing this kind of DNA work for unknown parents. The group DNA Detectives has tens of thousands of people in it. But doing, identifying unknown parents for Jewish people is incredibly complicated by endogamy. And Adina and I have learned that not everyone can take on the kind of cases that we have taken on, like Jackie's case, like identifying, the father of a baby born in a concentration camp, which I did a couple of years ago, identifying a toddler who was found in an orphanage after the war. She had no idea who her family was. The only way to do it was via DNA. And it's this incredibly complicated process of reverse engineering a tree for which you need both experience working with endogamy, and you need desperately a good grounding in Jewish paper genealogy. So, Adina and I realized at some point, like, wow, we're doing this on this sort of ad hoc, basis for a handful of people here. Wouldn't it be great if we actually had a platform to sort of try to do it, on a bigger scale? So that's why we're here.
And that's what the DNA Reunion Project is, in conjunction with the Center for Jewish History. And so now I think is a good moment to segue to a case study, so to speak, that exemplifies what this can do for people. I think when we talk about DNA, it all sounds very abstract and sciencey, and we have to remember that this is achieving material results for people and helping to pull back from this incredible abyss that was the Holocaust, fragments of information that can change people's lives. And with that said, Jackie, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now to talk about your story a little bit. And if you and Jennifer and Adina have had a lot of contact, so I sort of want to turn it over to you three now. And Jackie, why don't you begin by introducing briefly describing what your story is, what brought you to Adina and Jennifer, or what brought them to you, and how all this got started.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Right. Well, I started off as a little baby in Vienna, born 2 weeks' time, I'll be 81. And I was put into an orphanage by who I don't know, born in the Rothschild Hospital in Vienna, put into a camp in a place called Theresienstadt, and flown over by the RAF at liberation by the Russians to England. Got two wonderful people who adopted me. I had no knowledge. I thought for a long time, that's how you get parents, by just two people getting hold of me and putting me in a car. And life went on beautifully until I got 3 messages that seemed to change that perception. One was a kid came up to me in school and said, "You're adopted." I didn't know what he was talking about. It was confirmed by my parents. And then the second one, my adopted grandmother told me I was Austrian. I thought she was out of a cotton picking mind. And I said to my parents, they confirmed that. And then when I get married, I was confirmed, I had to prove I was Jewish to get married into a lovely synagogue. And that's when I got the full deal that I was in a camp for 2 years, 8 months as a 9-month-old baby. Coming to a certain age, I had burning desires to obviously find my background of who I was. My parents, who were very loving and kind, just couldn't tell me my past. They very reticent. They said, "Why you're hurting us to try and find my past." Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't want to hurt them, so I more or less sat on for a long time. Well, to cut a long story short, a couple of years ago, I just said, this is my last chance saloon. I have no knowledge of my father. I knew who my mother and just a few other people were from a place in Vienna called the Israel Gutsgemein, which is the archive place. And they furnished me with some evidence of my mother, Elsa Spiegel. I was born Yona Spiegel, although I'm Jackie Young now. And so I was quite satisfied that I had a burning desire, who was my father, because my mother didn't put his name on my birth certificate. And so I approached a company in London, and he put me on a TV program, and they mentioned names, but none that I knew, but they did enlarge my family a little bit. And then I got the fabulous message from two people who you may know, Adina and Mendelsohn, Jennifer, and they said, we'd like to take you further. And well, that's when the door opened so much wider. They furnished me with my father's name, his whereabouts, and a huge family I had no knowledge of. And for me, it really filled me with a lot of happiness to know that I have the full knowledge of my family.
Mm-hmm. I want to, just before I hand over the conversation to Jennifer and Adina, you said that your parents didn't want to discuss it, and I think that's even without the Holocaust element, that's not uncommon among adoptees and their parents. But what did they actually know that they might have told you?
Oh, they had lots of papers. This is the papers that actually told me about my past, that she had in a safe deposit box, in a very big safety box. You wouldn't know, imagine, like a huge vault anyway. And that really told me the whole deal. It really did.
And these papers were prepared by whom? And how did they come to your parents?
Well, as you know, the Germans had amazing, putting down records, and that's basically that's why they knew so much about me, where I came from, and where I was born, and everything. And they just would not tell me a thing. Literally speaking, I had a bundle of people around my mother and father's family who were totally silent to my request to know more about my past. And family, I don't have to tell you, is the foundation of it all, isn't it? It's right. It's the big right. deal.
So Jennifer and Adina, why don't you start in by saying how Jackie's story sort of came across your desk, so to speak. Who wants to go first?
I'll go ahead. So Jackie's story was written about in Times of Israel when he appeared on the DNA Family Secrets show for the BBC. And we were intrigued because it seemed like a case right up our alley, but we were puzzled because for whatever reason, they showed Jackie sort of meeting relatives on the show, but they didn't seem to have specifically identified who his father was. And we just, wondered if there was a reason why they hadn't been able to, because we do unknown parent work, and normally unknown parent work ends with the identification of parents. And we, I think it was Adina's idea to let's talk to him, let's see, and we through our Facebook group, as we said, we have over 10,000 members around the world of people sort of interested in Jewish genetic genealogy. The article was posted, and I think somebody in the group said that their mother was a neighbor of Jackie's, and I sent her a message and said, can you put us in touch with him? We'd like to see if we can really identify his father for him once and for all. And I'll let Adina talk a little bit about the process and how we got there.
Yeah, so I think it needs to be understood that the story was initially in the Times of Israel when we read it, and it made the rounds in all of the Jewish genealogy groups. So everyone was seeing it. So once we got a hold of Jackie, put us in touch with the television show, the BBC, to get access to his DNA. And we had to kind of figure out where he tested. And as is recommended in a lot of these cases of finding biological parents, he was on all the sites that we would look into, Ancestry, MyHeritage, 23andMe, and we just had a lot of matches. And, fortunately for us, there was some work that had been done before by the people on the TV show, but we quickly saw that there were some clear lines to Vienna and an area also called Lachenbach, which I believe was in Hungary, today is in Austria. And I think it was actually Jennifer who noticed this very quickly. We had an idea of the line based on what you might have seen on the TV show, but we used, they have what are called haplogroups on 23andMe, and haplogroups are that matrilineal line you get, you know, haplogroup and the patrilineal line. So they call it the paternal haplogroup. And there was a match who had the same haplogroup as Jackie. And, you know, Jennifer quickly did some digging and we came up with the name Cornfide. And I will say that you don't want to typically rely on haplogroups in general, especially when you're dealing with an endogamous population. But this was a fairly close match. And we had seen that name in our research. So we kind of just went up the tree and then back down again. And we really quickly landed on who we thought the father was. But really what we needed to do was figure out who can we DNA test to prove it. Because it's one thing to have the paper trail and have your hypothesis, but you need to find someone. And that can be part of the difficulty in doing this work, is finding a survivor, because so often, you know, a branch is just, you know, it's gone because in the early 1940s. So, you know, we did, fortunately for all of us, we found a few of the closest relatives. And I will say literally one that was living in the United States. And I called this person, Jennifer and I put this off for a very, we were nervous. So I called and it was a very poor connection. And then I, you know, it was a cold call and I said, hi, my name is Adina Newman. I'm a professional genealogist. This is a very odd request, but I'm helping this man, Jackie Young. Would you be willing to take a DNA test? And it was much more, it was a better conversation than that, but he didn't say anything. And I said, oh my goodness, you know, he's going to say no, but it was just a poor connection on his end. And he said, hold on, I'll go outside. So he, you know, he said, can you say that again? And, you know, long story short, again, he agreed. And again, literally the only person in the United States who could do this test. The other potential matches for Jackie are all over the world. He has a very, very robust family tree now. And he agreed to test. And, you know, a few weeks later, we got the confirmation. So it was just really remarkable. Jennifer, did I leave anything out of the story? I mean, it was quite the emotional time for us going through this and trying to give closure to Jackie.
So basically, just to elaborate, you know, we identified a man who we suspected, based on the more distant matches that Jackie had, was his biological father, furthering our suspicion that we had the right man. You know, we did a little mapping and discovered that, you know, at the time he was deported a few months after Jackie's birth, he was living very close to Jackie's biological mother, which all seemed to, you know, sort of confirm that we were on the right path. But the only way, as we said, to prove it, Jackie's DNA matches were no closer than like third cousins. So in order to confirm it, we needed the closest match possible. So the gentleman that we found in St. Louis, his father was Jackie's first cousin. So we knew that if he matched at the level of a first cousin once removed, that we had the right man. And the results came back, and Adina and I did a dance of joy. And, you know, we knew that there was no other explanation other than we had finally identified who Jackie's father was. And we also discovered, sadly, that Jackie had a half brother as well, who perished at Auschwitz at the age of 19. But, you know, we were able to finally give Jackie the answers he was looking for and connect him with a relatively close relative. And, you know, he can tell us how that felt or what that meant to him.
I was just going to ask, well, I just wanted to ask first, Jennifer and Adina, so did you called him, or what was the process?
Jackie? We called Jackie? Are you asking?
Yeah.
We Zoomed.
We zoomed.
Oh, you
We
Zoomed.
zoomed.
And so, Jackie, when you finally got this information, what was that like for you?
Blew me away, didn't it? It blew me away. It was the most amazing to know the names of people I'd never heard of, particularly obviously my father. And it was, I mean, I've got on my wall, I have the tree. I've got a nice framed tree of now the family, and it looks like a proper family, you know, it's big.
And
I want to ask a question, and we're soon going to be moving to questions from the audience. I noticed the time is going very fast, but so Jackie, you were born in 1941. Is
Almost
that
42, almost 2 weeks from 42, yeah.
so? How does an infant survive? I mean, I think this is a non-DNA question. This is a historical question. I know that Theresienstadt was the so-called model camp, where there was a good degree of a sort of Potemkin village of pretending that things were better for the people there. But how is it? I'd like to know what, and I'm sure people in the audience are curious. As we know, unfortunately, it's very hard for children to survive, let alone infants, during the Holocaust. So what was the sequence of events that got you there and how you got out?
Well, as I said, the Gestapo apparently found me in the orphanage, and I found out the orphanage that I was in, all the people that went to Theresienstadt, they went on to Auschwitz and were murdered. For whatever reason, I was left in the baby ward in Theresienstadt, 2 years, 8 months. Who kept me? I don't know. There was a mention of a woman who was the head nurse there, was Martha Wenger. Other than that, I have no recollection. My life, you could say, really started here in the UK, because I really didn't have any memories. The only time I ever had anything to go on in my brain was when I used to have dreams, and I used to go to my parents and say, I had a dream about this house with a terrace down to a horse racing track. And they would dismiss it. And it turns out that was the second place I stayed at when I first arrived. Only after a year, I was in this place. I could walk through the house, I could see it as it was, but my parents wouldn't enlighten me again on the fact that was where you were placed in Sussex.
And what was the year that you ended up in England? When were you?
I arrived here in August 45. I was just approaching just around 4 years old. 4 years old. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Daniel, we've also, it's conjecture at this point, but it's our understanding that a certain number of children were kept alive sort of for PR purposes.
Yeah.
And Jackie, who we have to say was one of the most precious and darling children. We can share photos of him maybe from the Times of Israel article, was mercifully kept alive, perhaps because they needed photographs of certain children. But
right. I'm sure people in the audience, most people are aware that Theresienstadt was the model camp, and that was what they would show the Red Cross and the press. And so they had to clearly keep the facade of a kind of normalcy. And to that, Jackie, presumably you owe your life. I
was just part of the propaganda. I believe that they invited the Red Cross possibly into the baby ward where there was just a few of us there. And they said, look, if we're killing people, we got babies here,
Right.
Disprove that's very much what Putin's doing now, proving that he's not doing what he's doing.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I think that many people have seen the films that were taken during the Red Cross visits, where there is a tremendous amount of effort being put into the illusion of a kind of a more or less normal camp. I think this would be a good time to start entertaining questions from the audience, and I can see that there's almost 30 out there. So, Lauren?
Sure. I'd like to start with this one from Myra, because it's a pretty important basic questions that I think people need to understand. Can you please explain what the DNA Reunion Project is going to do? I've already tested my DNA. Are you keeping a database or just helping individuals?
Sure, I'll answer that. It's an excellent question, and we want to be very clear about that. Our goal with this project is number one, to just raise awareness that DNA testing can be a valuable tool for families affected by the Holocaust to, reunite with potential living relatives, learn more about their past. So we are making use of the existing commercial databases. We are hoping to start this pilot program where we will start getting kits into the hands of survivors who want them. And when there are cases like Jackie's, where there are, Holocaust people affected by the Holocaust whose questions can only be answered via DNA, I want to just take a moment and if it's not apparent. So, Jackie had paperwork telling him who his mother was. He had no idea who his father was. There was nobody on the planet who was going to be able to tell him that. And there was nothing written down anywhere that was going to be able to tell him that. But by DNA testing, we were able to use this, protocol that we follow, this reverse engineering process, working with his DNA matches that was able to narrow down and identify his father. So we're hoping to be able to offer that service for free to anyone else, hidden children. We've been working on a fascinating case this summer, Adina and I, the kind of case that, we want this project to address, where two women in Poland, no known Jewish history. They were both raised Catholic. They were both adoptees. However, they were pushed by their millennial granddaughters to take DNA tests because they heard that it was a way to find family. And their shocking discovery early this year at 80 years old was A, that they were both 100% Jewish, and B, that they were full sisters to one another. So we have been working with their DNA matches. They were completely broadsided by this discovery. They desperately want to know what their story is. And, as I've told this story, I say, when you know that you were found on the side of the road in the summer of 1942 in Poland and you think you're Catholic, it means one thing. When you are found on the side of the road in Poland in the summer of 1942 and now know that you're Jewish, it's a completely different story. And we are very, very close to identifying their parents. So it's a very specialized skill, and we're hoping that the project can help other people who need that very specialized skill.
And just to expand a little bit, since the questioner said she's already done DNA testing, well, then that's great. And if you are interested in the expertise of Adina and Jennifer, I have been putting the email address in the chat, dna@cjh.org, because I know they're going to be planning to do online workshops to help people interpret their DNA results. So, so you're halfway there. You already understand the potential benefits and you've done the testing. If you need help interpreting your results, please reach out to us. There were also a couple of questions about a prior project that I know you were both aware of and trying to reach out to. If you could tell us a little bit about that, the DNA Shoah project.
Yeah,
Adina?
so we became aware of that very quickly, and we tried to reach out to the founders, and we never heard back from them. But what they were trying to do is different from what we're trying to do. They were trying to create their own database for people to test and try to match people that way. As we said, we're not creating our own database. We're working with what's out there and what exists. Unfortunately, I don't think the people who tested through that project have their DNA in the commercial databases. So it would make sense to, either test for yourself or take advantage of this program.
The value is in the matches, and you want to go where the most people have tested. And so we're making use, our primary goal is to get people tested at Ancestry, because as Adina said earlier, it has the largest database. And people in our community joke, people always ask, well, where's the best place to test? Well, the best place to test is where your closest relatives have tested. And we have no idea of knowing which of the databases that is, but Ancestry has the most people in it. And that, so that is our primary goal. But, for certain cases, for specialized cases, we need the DNA in all of the sites, because that's the only way we can make sure that we've covered all our bases.
There is a question about something we didn't touch on today, which is privacy. What access must you agree to if you use Ancestry DNA? Must you agree that anyone can access your results and name? Will Ancestry give access to your sample to law enforcement? Will they use it for any other commercial purpose? Or is it restricted to the use of finding familial matches?
Okay, so there's a lot of conversation around the law enforcement piece. Jennifer and I always were huge proponents of informed consent. So always read the terms of service of the place where you're testing. As for law enforcement, one of the reasons that Ancestry DNA is our go-to is they are not accessible by law enforcement unless, you know, in the case of a warrant or something like that. And then they will fight to the, you know, as much as they can not to give information. And really, those are not the sites of somebody who has done work in that world. Ancestry and 23andMe and MyHeritage are not sites that give access to law enforcement. The ones that law enforcement are working with are Family Tree DNA and a third-party site called GenMatch. So, you know, we understand these privacy concerns, and we're not going to coerce anyone to do this. You know, you have to be comfortable with what you're doing. I can say personally, my DNA is in all of the databases. I have no personal concerns. I opt in, and there's an opt-in or opt-out choice. I opt in at GenMatch and Family Tree DNA. So if somehow they can use my DNA to solve, you know, a heinous crime, I'm happy if they do that. Other people don't feel that comfortable. But again, it's just about being informed and knowing what you're getting yourself into. And, you know, as a genetic genealogist, I have no, you know, concerns for myself.
Here's a question. I've been unable to find much in the way of paper records, so turned to DNA. I now have a lot of DNA data, but have only been able to make limited discoveries with it. Are there professional Jewish DNA consultants that I could hire? Well, 2 of them are on the call today to help me extract more information. My known family immigrated long before World War II, so I don't know if any relatives might have been survivors. By the way, I hate Facebook. So as I mentioned,
I was going to put a link in the chat for
Yeah.
those who don't hate Facebook to our Facebook group, because it is a great way to here, if I put it, someone can share it with everybody. I don't see a way to share it with everybody, but I just shared it with you, Lauren.
there should be a drop down to everyone.
Oh, I don't see a.
Okay, that's fine. I
Maybe,
will.
Lauren, you could just
I don't
share
have
the
an
link.
everyone option.
Okay.
You know, our group is a great resource for learning methods for working with Jewish DNA. There is a learning curve. It's not, you know, it's not for the faint of heart, but those issues are not insurmountable, as you know, as shown by our successes with Jackie and others. It is entirely possible to, you know, identify unknown Jewish parents if you know what you're doing. And, you know, we want to make clear that not every case will be as dramatic as Jackie's, and not every case will result in finding living relatives, but they sometimes will. And sometimes even short of those big dramatic reunions, there are small victories to be found, you know, just identifying people by name, knowing their fates. This doesn't have to be, you know, this, you don't just have to sort of gesture and say, oh yes, well, I know I lost family. There really are records that can help many, many people. Occasionally, there are in fact people who fall through the cracks, but we really want to dispel this notion that, you know, it's a lost cause. I cannot tell you how many times people have said to me things like, you know, oh, I would love to know where my grandmother came from, but they didn't keep birth records in that town in Poland. You know, 3 seconds later, I'm on the Polish Archives website. Here's your grandmother's birth certificate. You know, it really, we want to sort of shout from the rooftops that this is possible, and especially for this community where what they have lost is family. What we want to do is give back family. And I also, you know, while I have the floor, just want to underscore what Adina said. If people have discomfort or privacy concerns about DNA testing, do not do it. We are not in the business of coercing anyone or making anyone feel uncomfortable. We know that those concerns exist. But on the flip side, we want to show you successes like Jackie's and know that, you know, if you can get comfortable with whatever privacy concerns there are, it can do enormous things for you. But I am not in the business of forcing anyone to take a test who does not want to take a test. We just want you to know what is possible if you do take a test.
And we've gotten this question coming in through various avenues, people saying, you know, I've already had DNA tested on a few sites. How can I participate in this project? Are you planning to have a database? Well, as you said, we're not creating a separate database. So from my perspective, I would encourage those people to get on the mailing list so that they will learn about workshops on interpreting their results. I would encourage them, if they are capable of contributing to the project, to make sure we can get the kits into the hands of other survivors who have not been able to test. Do you have anything to add to that, Jennifer or Adina?
Not on that specific point, but I see a question I would like to make sure we answer before our time is up.
Sure. I'm not going to cut it off and we're in the middle of speaking and we can go a few minutes.
Okay. Okay, I just don't want to, you know, we everyone wants to watch the soccer. I know that. We got to. We have a question about if you tested yourself. Is it helpful to have a sibling test? What's the best structure to test? You plus a parent, female sibling, male sibling, blah, 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 blah. We're going to have FAQs on the website going up soon, hopefully, that will cover all this, but I just want to get that out of the way. If your interest in this project is because there is a living survivor in your family, we want to test them. Their children don't bring anything new to the, like testing their children doesn't help us or add anything new. If you've already tested the survivor, there's no need to test the children because they have half of the survivor's DNA. We always want to get as close to the source as possible. In terms of gender, that is another pervasive, myth that we hear. People think for some reason that men are better candidates for DNA testing for some reason. There is absolutely no gender advantage to the kind of testing we do. Men can do it, women can do it. And we've also had questions about, if I'm a woman, will this tell me about my father's side of the family? Yes. The tests that we use are autosomal DNA tests. Your autosomal DNA is inherited equally, 50% from your mother, 50% from your father. So the genetic contributions are 50% for each of them. What we can't foresee is, you may match with a lot of people on your father's side and not that many on your mother's side. That is completely random based on who has tested. But it's very important that people know that women can take these tests, men can take these tests. In terms of testing a sibling, the more the merrier. You have to sort of be judicious if you're doing this in terms of where you want to, spend your money. I, of course, am obsessive about this, so I have tested as many of my siblings as possible. But ideally, what you want is the older generation. So I tested my mother. My father, unfortunately, was deceased before I got into this, so I tested his brother. You want to think of it as you're trying to capture as much of your ancestors' DNA as possible. So think in your family, who is it may not be the oldest person, but you want the oldest generation. Who has the most of your ancestors' DNA? So you always want to look up the family tree to those people.
Do you narrow down your searches to 1%, 2%, or 3%? What percent do you start with?
Adina, I think they're talking about sharing and that gets.
Yeah, so it's really hard to answer that because there's so much more to this than 1%, 2%, 3%. We look at, because of endogamy, we, look at it, segment size, the length of how long your segments are. But again, I don't want to get into the weeds of kind of how this all works, but it's more than just a percentage around the third cousin level. We have to see larger chunks of DNA shared because it means that you're likely related through a more recent and traceable common ancestor, as opposed to those teeny tiny segments that may have come through, generation after generation. I think what's the number, 20 centimorgans segment could be as far as 10 plus generations back. We can't typically trace that far within our community, so we're really trying to look at, if somebody shares 1%, DNA or 1.5%, and we're dealing with a 35 centimorgan longest segment versus a 10 centimorgan longest segment, that makes a difference in how we approach the match. So
Right.
just these rules that we work with during this process to figure out what's a legitimate match.
Again,
There are a couple.
we don't want to get too far in the weeds, but for those people who sort of understand that question and are familiar with these terms, you know, one way of thinking of it is 100 centimorgan match over 4 segments a 100 centimorgan match over 4 segments is a much more meaningful match than 150 centimorgan match over 13 segments, which can just be endogamy. It's the total is less important than the size of the segments. So that's one thing that we look for that, you know, helps us land on the real relatives and not just the endogamous ones.
There are a couple of questions for and about Jackie. Jackie, do you know what happened to your biological parents, and were your adoptive parents Jewish?
My adopted parents were Jewish, made me go to Haida from age of about 6, and I stayed there till 13. What was the other question?
About your biological parents.
Well, my birth mother was Elsa Spiegel, born in Vienna. Now I know my father was born in Lachenbach, in just 40 miles south of Vienna. And basically, my grandmother, I do know about my grandmother on my mother's side. She died in 1939 in a home. I think they said she was something wrong with her, and she was put into the Central Friedhof in Vienna cemetery. There was no stone there, so when I arrived and I was found out where she was placed, I had a stone put down there for her. But it's the only closest I've ever got to actually, until Adina and Jennifer got in touch with these 2 people in St. Louis. That was the closest I ever got to anybody who was related to me, somebody under 6 foot of earth. And
It was incredibly exciting because, you know, in our line of work, you're not supposed to put too much emphasis on resemblance because it can, you know, lead you astray. But when we saw the photographs of Jackie's cousin in Missouri, we got I mean, they really, really, really look alike.
Really
and
look
would
alike.
be exciting for Jackie to finally meet someone who looked like him.
Yeah, and the beautiful part was they saw the resemblance as well. There was another cousin in France, and she was just very emotional because she saw how much Jackie looked like her late father. And unfortunately, we were not able to find photos of Jackie's biological father, but there are photos of biological uncles and cousins. So I'm thinking that was helpful, Jackie, just to have a sense of what your family looked like.
Yeah, my 2 daughters, Nicole and Elisa, both think they recognize relatives of mine looking a little bit like me. But there you go. But mind you, the only difference was their ears stick out and mine don't.
You got lucky. Please let me know if there's a cost to interpreting the results and with any help provided by Jennifer and Adina. So the center is not charging for this service. I mean, obviously there are only 2 people and funds are limited, and that's why we are fundraising for this project. So feel free to get on our mailing list. There was a question that I had seen about whether being registered for this project gets you on the DNA mailing list. No, if you would like to be added to that mailing list, please email dna@cjh.org. Here's a question. What help exists to handle the mechanics of ordering kits, getting DNA samples, and submitting and accessing them for a child survivor who is unable to manage this process? I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. The child survivor would receive the kit at their home and would actually need to do the mechanics of, you know, submitting the saliva. Do you want to answer that, Jennifer or Dina?
You know, again, people have to sort of find their way to us. If there is a survivor in your life who, you know, you would like to get tested, you know, someone needs to have an email address to register the kit. So, you could do it on their behalf. You could get the sample. We can't go into people's homes and get samples. At this point, part of what we would like to have happen is awareness, get us those survivors. Let's get them tested before it's too late and have, one thing we haven't touched on that's important. So I told you the story of my husband's grandmother, and that was accomplished without DNA, but I did DNA test her. And 5 years after she died, she got a significant match to a woman. So, that can be important. The DNA will remain in the databases even after these survivors are gone. And it can bring wholeness to their families. In that case, that ended up enabling this entire second reunion, which was crazy. This woman was a DNA match to Frida. We started conversing. She mentioned that on the side of her family that wasn't related to Frida, she had always wondered what had happened to these 4 first cousins of her mother. She knew that her mother's aunt had perished. And to make a very, very long story short, I started following the trail for her, and all 4 of those women had survived in hiding, and 2 of them were still alive in 2018. So that enabled a second reunion. It's even if, and remember also that new people test all the time. If you get your results and you don't have any meaningful matches, that's okay. 6 months down the road, somebody may test, the more people that test, the more we can do.
Here's one quick question that I think would be helpful for people to understand. I have used 23andMe. Do I need to subscribe to Ancestry, or is there a way to share my existing results with them?
So 23andMe is one of those tests where you have to test there and you can transfer, and that's a whole other conversation, to sites like MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, but you cannot transfer to Ancestry. You need to test at Ancestry DNA to have access to Ancestry DNA. You can use the tools on Ancestry. The DNA piece can be separate from the paper trail building your tree piece. So that's possible. In our experience, 23andMe is personally my favorite site because I like to play with tools, but it is not the best for reuniting families because the database is limited. It's harder to make sense of some of the match. It's not as genealogy user friendly. So we do recommend, if you're looking for family, Ancestry is really where you need to be testing your DNA. But again, I have my DNA everywhere. Most genetic genealogists have their DNA everywhere because you never know where that match is going to pop up. And we have unique matches that have tested on all of the sites.
We should also add, if there are people out there who, have the resources and wherewithal and want to go and test on their own and don't want to wait to see if they qualify for a free test, what we recommend doing if you want to cover all your bases, you want to test at Ancestry first, then you want to test at 23andMe, and you can upload for free into the 2 other databases without buying another test. So that way we say you fish in all ponds, you get the most bang for your buck. So if you want to sort of go down this path on your own, Ancestry's on sale today for Cyber Monday sale, I think, is still on. So that's what you would need to do to make sure you're covered. Buy Ancestry and 23andMe, and then you can upload into the other 2. Oh, one thing we didn't cover that it just occurs to me randomly, we didn't talk about, one of the fallacies is people get very hung up on their ethnicity estimates. Ethnicity estimates as a Jewish genealogist are sort of the least interesting part of this whole process. That 1% you get of, Swedish or Mongolian
Scandinavian
or
in my case.
Scandinavian. Ethnicity estimates are, just that, estimates. They are not measuring, there is nothing in your cells scientifically that is going to identify exactly where you come from. They are generated by comparing you to a reference population. So there can be, that's why you get different estimates from different companies. But again, the work that we do, I barely even pay attention to ethnicity estimates. The work that we do, the meat is in the matches, because, the matches can, I'll very briefly tell you, this is not a Holocaust story, but Daniel and I have a great grandmother about whom nothing was known. And she did none of the things on paper that typically allow us to get a bead on someone's place of origin. All we knew was that we knew her name and she was from Russia, which of course, can mean a bazillion different things. And through DNA match, and her story was that she was orphaned in a pogrom and had no family and came here all by herself as a teenager. We didn't know her parents' names. We didn't know where she was from. And via DNA matches to my mother, I have been able to reconstruct her entire tree. We now know exactly what town they were from. We know that contrary to her story that she was all alone, she had a brother in Brooklyn and a sister in New Jersey. That's, again, that has nothing to do with the Holocaust, but that is what can happen by taking a test. You get a match, and because of your closeness to that person, you know that you are related. And because maybe that person has access to a paper trail that can open up these, find answers to questions that you can't find on your own. It just happened again over the weekend. I uploaded my father-in-law's test to MyHeritage, which I had not done before. And his family has the problem of they came very, very early, and naturalizations give very scant information. And we knew they were Lithuanian, but we didn't know what town they were from. There's a match to a woman whose maiden name is his surname. She lives in New York. We don't know her from Adam. They never would have found each other except for the fact that their DNA matches. Her family came much later. They have naturalizations, they have information. So now I know, aha, I think they're from that same town. I can go look at the and that's invaluable, and never would have found it on paper. So I'm rambling, but as you can see, I'm very excited about this project and its possibilities, especially for Holocaust survivors and their family.
Yeah. I would like to add, though, one piece about the ethnicity estimates, because we work in this. A lot of the people that come across our paths are people who had no idea that they had any Jewish ancestry at all. So all of a sudden they take a DNA test. Why am I 25% Ashkenazi Jewish? So there are times we do use those numbers. And I also want to make it clear that if you found out about a relative like that and they have Holocaust ancestry also, please, consider reaching out to us as well as part of the project. It doesn't have to be something you grew up knowing your whole life. Maybe you found out that your biological parent happened to be a Holocaust survivor. So we want to be very clear on who qualifies and the eligibility there. That's when the ethnicity estimates do matter in our line of work.
Okay, well, we are going over time, so I want to just finish up with these two very quick questions. Must you be a survivor, or can it be someone who came over pre-World War II? We are defining survivor as someone who was either persecuted under the Nazis or fled Nazi persecution. And is the DNA reunion project projected to remain in effect for the next few years? Well, we certainly hope so, and that's why we're launching it on Giving Tuesday, as I mentioned. And I put the link a few times in the chat for the donation button. So we hope that you can help us out. And I'd like to thank this wonderful panel, and especially Jackie for joining us. And thank you, Daniel, for moderating, and Adina and Jennifer for doing this work. And it was a wonderful conversation. And as I mentioned, it has been recorded, and you will be able to watch it on the center's webpage and YouTube page. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye now.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.